They were just finishing dinner when the doorbell rang. 12-year-old Lori jumped up to answer the door before her father or brother could get up, but quickly returned to the dining room with a bewildered expression on her face. "It's a policeman, Daddy." "He wants to talk to you," she informed him. Frank was struck with fear, but he did his best to hide it from his children. When he got to the door, he saw that the caller was actually a Georgia State Trooper. "Are you Frank Parker?" the policeman asked. "Yes," Frank confirmed. "Are you Meredith Parker's husband?" When Frank nodded, the policeman looked at the two children and said, "May I speak to you in private, Mr. Parker?" Frank felt his throat constrict and had to clear it before he could speak. "Bobby, Lori, please go to your rooms. I need to talk to the officer alone." Both children started to protest, but when their father barked at them, "Now!" they jumped up and hurried to obey. They were not used to hearing such a tone of voice. Once the children had left the room, the officer turned to their father again. "Mr. Parker, I've been asked to give you some bad news. Your wife's airplane is missing and presumed shot down. It disappeared from radar tonight about halfway between Miami International Airport and Nassau. A Coast Guard ship is now in the area looking for survivors." The facts were simple enough. Serving as vice president of regional sales for a large multinational corporation, Meredith traveled with the region's CFO to visit their Caribbean headquarters in the Bahamas. She was an experienced small airplane pilot, so a 180-mile flight to Nassau should have been routine. Frank hadn't given it much thought when Meredith had called and informed him of her plans. Now he was distraught. It was his worst nightmare. His wife's plane had crashed overnight in the shark-infested waters of the Caribbean. The officer gave a few additional details that were not at all reassuring to Frank, and promised that the Coast Guard would call in the morning or sooner if there was any news. No sooner had the door closed behind the policeman than Bobby and Lori came running up to him with concern on their faces, asking questions their father couldn't answer. Frank knew they were eavesdropping. He'd be eavesdropping too if he were in their shoes. The three of them huddled together, each trying to find encouraging words to say to the other. Lori began to cry, and though he tried to be brave, Bobby's eyes turned red as well. Frank was trying his best to hold himself together for the sake of his children, but inside he was beyond furious. Doing the dishes or homework was out of the question. They spent the rest of the evening at arm's length from each other. It was past the time when the children usually went to bed, but there was still no phone call. Finally, exhausted by the late hour and their fears, all three of them moved into the bedroom, and the children fell asleep with their father for the first time since they were small and afraid of thunderstorms. The next morning, they were already up and trying to eat breakfast when a Coast Guard representative called. The faint hope generated by the call was quickly extinguished when the officer informed Frank that the boat combing the area had found nothing. Frank called the principal of the middle school the children attended and told her why Bobby and Lori would be absent that day. He then went to check on them, but found them sitting in front of the television watching a CNN report on the missing airplane. Frank wasn't sure if he should let them watch further or turn off the TV, but no sooner had he made up his mind than the phone rang again. And from then on, as soon as Frank hung up after one call, another one came in. Not surprisingly, Meredith's parents and his own were the first to call. All of them were beyond worried, but they were also trying to exude false optimism that she would miraculously be found. Frank promised to call back immediately with any news. Then followed calls from Meredith's friends and co-workers. Everyone wanted to say or do something to help, but none of them had any idea how to do it. The conversations were short and awkward. The most difficult of all were the calls from members of the media. He should have expected them, but Frank was caught off guard when the first reporter called, and he talked to the Journal-Constitution reporter much longer than he wanted to. Then other media started calling, and when Frank realized what was going on, he started screening out all the calls and answering only those from people he cared about. During all this activity, a procession of neighbors and friends began, each coming to their doors with condolences and food. At first, their generosity was appreciated, as Frank did not have the energy to cook, but soon he and his children had more food than they could hope to eat in a week. It was an old Southern tradition to express concern and condolences with food. But while Frank appreciated the gesture, every roast and casserole was a bitter reminder that his wife, with whom he had lived for 20 years, was almost certainly dead. The next few days were horrible. The Parkers were virtually prisoners in their own home, held together by a desire not to deal with other people and the hope of some news from the Coast Guard. Frank called the Miami office daily for the latest news, but the reports were always negative. And 5 days after a state trooper showed up on their doorstep, the news they had been dreading came. A Coast Guard officer called to inform Frank that the wreckage of his wife's plane had been found. There was no sign of survivors. "I'm sorry, sir," the officer concluded, "but at this time we have to cease search and rescue efforts." Frank wanted only one thing: to hide and mourn alone. But there was no such opportunity. Instead, he was faced with an endless list of responsibilities, all of them excruciating. The worst part, of course, was breaking the sad news to Bobby and Lori and trying to comfort them. When they finally calmed down, he had to call family and close friends to let them know. Then he called their church to organize a memorial service, then the newspaper to write an obituary. More calls followed to let them know the time and date of the service. By the time he finished the job, Frank felt physically and emotionally exhausted. Somehow, the family made it through the service and began the slow, painful process of trying to get back to normal life. The children returned to school the following week, and resuming a familiar lifestyle seemed to help a little. Frank was less fortunate. He now had a whole new set of responsibilities. At the urging of a friend, Frank contacted a lawyer to find out what his legal responsibilities were. He was shocked to learn that he would have to apply for a death certificate. "But her plane crashed at sea," he protested. "How can there be any doubt?" "I know," the lawyer lamented, "but in the absence of a body and a doctor's note, the court must make an official statement." "Do I really have to wait 7 years?" asked Frank in frustration. "No," his lawyer assured him. "In cases like this one, where a person has gone missing at sea, there are usually no significant delays. After the attack on the World Trade Center, death certificates were issued within days, although some bodies were never identified. You may have to answer some questions, but these cases are usually resolved very quickly." "I can draft a petition for you," the attorney continued. "I can also help you amend all the other documents." When Frank looked confused, the lawyer said, "Well, you know, like joint bank accounts, mortgages, insurance, car titles, wills, anything. While I'm at it, you need to contact your wife's company and find out what benefits you're entitled to and get all your personal belongings." Frank shook his head tiredly. In his grief, he couldn't stop thinking about how difficult it would be to unravel the life he and his wife had shared. Now he had one more thing to do that he dreaded: to call the widow of John Collier, the CFO who was on the plane with Meredith. Frank had only met Collier a couple of times at his wife's company events, but he immediately disliked the executive. In Frank's opinion, Collier was one of those narcissistic types who think they are smarter than everyone else. In the short time Frank spent with him, Collier had managed to list enough names and brag about his accomplishments to leave a bad taste in Frank's mouth. But it was not his widow's fault, Frank reminded himself, and he felt it his duty to address her. Frank called ahead, and Amanda Collier was already waiting for him. As they exchanged condolences, Frank realized that she was probably the only one who truly understood how he felt. As they settled down in her parlor, she asked affectionately, "How are you now, Frank?" "It's hard, Amanda, really hard. I just can't accept that she's really gone. So many things remind me of her." He shook his head helplessly. "You know what the hardest part is? When I'm on the street or in a crowd of people, I keep thinking I've spotted her. The other day, I must have scared some poor woman half to death when I caught up with her because I thought it was Meredith." He looked at the floor, recalling the memories and his emotions when he realized what he was doing. Amanda looked at him sympathetically. She knew that no words would help. Finally, he looked up at her. "And you, Amanda, how are you doing?" "It's not easy, Frank, but I can handle it," she told him. "The truth is, I'm probably coping a lot better than you are. John and I didn't have children, so I don't have two to comfort them the way you do. Besides, and I wouldn't tell this to anyone else, John and I didn't really get along before all this happened. I've caught him having a couple affairs in the past, and I think he was in the middle of another affair. If that hadn't happened, we'd probably be headed for divorce a long time ago." "I'm sorry to hear that, Amanda," Frank told her sympathetically. "I can only imagine the conflicting emotions you are feeling." "Yes," she agreed. "One moment I'm relieved that I don't have to deal with his cheating anymore, and the next I feel guilty because I don't feel any sadder. And no matter what, some part of me still misses him." "Are you going to be okay financially?" asked Frank, trying to change the subject. I'm not sure, she admitted. The good news is that the company insured Frank's life, and since he died while on a business trip, under the double indemnity clause, I'll get twice the face value. The bad news is that I'm going to need every penny of that money because I learned that Frank made a series of bad investments in the futures market and severely depleted our assets. What Amanda had said about her late husband didn't surprise Frank. He could not believe that a selfish man like John Collier would not be a faithful husband. Besides, the idea that Collier fancied himself a market trader was entirely consistent with Frank's idea of the man. Frank's attention was drawn to Amanda's mention of company-paid life insurance. He remembered his lawyer's advice and made a mental note to contact Meredith's benefits department immediately. If Collier was insured, Meredith must have life insurance, and until he found a job, the funds might come in handy. After chatting for a few more minutes, Frank rose from the couch. Amanda, please forgive me, but I have to cut my visit short. Billy and Lori will be getting out of school soon, and I need to pick them both up. But please stay in touch, and if there's anything I can do to help, even if you just need to duck a sympathetic ear, please don't hesitate to call me. When Frank pulled up to their house after picking up Bobby and Lori, he was surprised to see a car parked out front. Frank led the children into the house through the garage, and a minute later, the doorbell rang. Outside stood a man in his 50s and a young woman dressed in business clothes. I'm Special Agent Harold Barnes, the man introduced himself, and this is Special Agent Celia Murray. We're with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. We'd like to stop by and ask you a few questions in connection with your wife's disappearance. Realizing that the two men were law enforcement officers, Lori wrapped her arms around her father's waist and buried her face in his side. Frank felt her tears wet his shirt and held her tightly against him. What does that mean? He demanded angrily. Before the first agent could speak, Agent Murray intervened. I'm very sorry we've upset your daughter, Mr. Parker. All we are trying to do is complete a routine check in connection with your application for Mrs. Parker's death certificate. If you would like us to come back later, we will try to do so at your convenience. Frank ignored her and turned to face his daughter. It's okay, sweetheart. Nothing bad happened. The female agent dropped dramatically to one knee, reached into her purse, pulled out a napkin, and held it out to the girl. Here, honey, she said in a gentle voice. Lori hesitated and timidly accepted the napkin, wiped her eyes, and then blew her nose. When Frank saw that his daughter had calmed down, he put his arm around her and spoke to her. These people need to talk to me a little bit about your mom, Lori. Why don't you go and start doing your homework? I'll be here in the living room if you need me. With those words, he gave the 12-year-old girl a gentle nudge toward her room. He then turned to face the officers. If it doesn't take too long, let's try to get it over with. The three of them walked into the living room and settled around the coffee table. We need to get a little information about your wife, Mr. Parker, the male agent began. How long were you married? We got married in 1990, right after graduating from the University of Georgia, Frank replied, remembering the beautiful brunette he had won over so many years earlier. And she worked for the International Marketing Corporation until, well, before she disappeared? That's right, Frank confirmed. She was vice president of sales for the southeastern United States. If her region is the southeast, why would she go to the Bahamas? A younger woman asked. At IMC, Frank explains, the southeast included Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, as well as the United States. Their Caribbean headquarters was in Nassau, so Mary often had to fly there. Mary? The woman asked. Frank felt his voice grow hoarse. Mary was my pet name for her. Agent Murray reached out and patted him sympathetically on the shoulder. It's all right, Mr. Parker. I know this is hard on you. The senior agent decided to change the line of questioning. Was it normal for your wife to fly her own plane on business trips? Yes, Frank replied. Mary's father was a pilot, and she got her license as soon as she was old enough. She took every opportunity to fly herself because, she said, it made her independent of commercial airline schedules. She said she could get where she needed to go, complete her business, and return home while her competitors were still stuck in the terminal. She felt it gave her an advantage, especially when she was just starting out. Both agents took notes, then Agent Murray looked up at him. What about you, Mr. Parker? What do you do? Frank managed to smile. I'm a house husband. Noticing their looks, he continued. I was an aerospace engineer until 3 years ago when my company downsized and I was laid off. The only chance of finding a new job would have required me to move out of state. But in the meantime, Mary's job was going great. She had gotten several big promotions and was making an excellent salary plus big bonuses. It didn't make sense for her to quit, so we agreed that I would run the household and take care of the kids while she worked. And how has this change affected your relationship with Mrs. Parker? Agent Barnes asked. What's that got to do with it? Asked Frank irritably. Please bear with us, Mr. Parker, the younger woman intervened. We need to see if any factors played a role in your wife's disappearance. This is routine procedure. Calming down a bit, Frank looked at them both. Sure, it was a big change for me, but I'm an engineer. I'm trained to measure and evaluate all factors in a design. It was easy to realize that my change in role was the right thing for our family at that moment. I let Mary devote himself to his career and made sure Bobby and Lori were always close to their parents. Neither agent said anything, and it seemed to Frank that the question hung in the air like that. I don't mean to say it was easy, he continued. She was always calling clients or attending meetings at the corporation, so I didn't see her as often as I would have liked. Sometimes I felt like her work came first, and... He suddenly realized what he was saying and added hastily. But that's quite common in corporate life. Besides, things have been going well. He caught himself that things had been going well so far. 2 more questions, Mr. Parker, Agent Barnes said. Did you notice any changes in your wife's behavior in the time leading up to her disappearance? Not really, Frank replied after a moment's thought. I know she's been under a lot of pressure the last year or so, and her travel schedule has been busier than ever. But Mary said she was in line for a serious promotion. When she got it, she promised that the new job would cut down on her travel and come with a high-ranking position and a big pay increase. One last question, Agent Barnes said, jotting down notes in his notebook. Are you aware of any changes in your finances that your wife may have made in the last few months? No, Frank answered confidently. I keep an eye on all our finances and haven't seen anything out of the ordinary. The young woman glanced at her partner. I think we've taken up enough of your time, Mr. Parker. We'll be able to wrap this up pretty quickly, and we'll let you know as soon as we're done. In the meantime, if you think of anything you think we should know, give me a call at this number. Having said that, she handed him her business card, and the 2 agents headed for the door. Frank went back to his children's bedrooms to make sure they had done their homework. When he peeked into their rooms, both looked busy. They're strong kids, he thought. They've been through hell and are holding up well no matter what. The next day, Frank drove to IMC headquarters to visit the benefits department. The head of the department met him, and after expressing her condolences, handed him a box of Meredith's personal belongings from her office. Frank had to swallow when he saw the framed family portrait she kept on her desk. The director then referred him to a specialist to advise him on Meredith's benefits. The first thing he did was examine Meredith's 401k account. Frank had read her annual reports regularly, so he didn't expect any surprises. However, when he saw the total, it was much higher than he had expected. Apparently, Meredith had increased her contributions to her retirement fund over the past year, even more than she was entitled to from the company. She was really trying to provide for her family, the specialist commented admiringly. The specialist further advised Frank to withdraw the funds as soon as possible and roll them into his own IRA to make it easier for him to manage the funds. Another surprise to Frank was the sheet he received describing the insurance benefit he would receive as Meredith's beneficiary. He learned that Meredith had chosen the maximum amount of insurance to which she was entitled. With the accidental death factor factored in, Frank realized with amazement that he would receive Meredith's income for almost 4 years. The insurance company will pay that amount in annual installments, the woman explained. Otherwise, the taxes will eat you alive. Payment of all benefits was, of course, contingent on the company receiving a copy of Meredith's death certificate. But after a visit from 2 GBI agents, Frank was confident that would happen soon. Frank left the office building with great relief. He had thought he would have to start looking for another job immediately. Now he realized that he had a significant reprieve to get his life together. Thank you, Mary, he whispered fervently. A few days later, Frank was preparing dinner for his family late one evening when the doorbell rang. When Frank went to answer it, he found Special Agent Murray on the doorstep. After he invited her in, she explained the purpose of her visit. Mr. Parker, Frank, I wanted to personally inform you that our investigation is complete and that your wife's death certificate has been issued. You should receive a copy from the court in the mail in the next few days. Frank breathed a sigh of relief. He had believed there would be no problems, but it was good to know that this important task had been accomplished. At that moment, a panicked cry came from the back of the house, and Frank was startled to hear Laurie's voice. "Daddy, help me! Help me!" He turned and rushed to Laurie's room. Celia Murray followed at his heels, her hand reaching for the service revolver in the shoulder holster under her jacket. When Frank burst into Laurie's room, he saw his daughter staring at a large red bloodstain on her jeans. "I'm bleeding, Daddy," she wailed. Frank was horrified. "What happened, Laurie? Did you cut yourself?" As he headed toward his daughter, someone's hand grabbed his elbow and pulled him back with sudden force. "Let me handle this," Celia said firmly and pushed him toward the door. "But he protested, but the young woman didn't back down. "I'll handle this, Frank. Just go out into the living room and wait." Something commanding in her voice made him pause, and when the determined young woman blocked his path, he hesitantly retreated into the hallway. Celia calmly closed the door in his face. After 15 anxious minutes, the door opened, and Celia appeared on the threshold. Before Frank could ask a question, she grabbed his arm. "Laurie's fine. You need to go to the store right now and buy a pack of sanitary napkins. Get the smallest size." "But Laurie, Bobby," he began to protest. "I'll take care of Laurie and let Bobby know what's going on. You, on the other hand, need to go to the store and get back here as soon as possible," she said. As Frank drove to the nearest store, it hit him, and he began to berate himself. "She's menstruating, you idiot. You should have realized it right away." On the way back, he kept cursing himself for never having talked to his daughter about growing up and becoming a woman. "Oh, Mary, I need you more than ever," he thought in self-pity. When he got home, Celia met him at the front door and snatched the package from him. Looking at the package, she smiled. "You did good, Daddy." Then she disappeared into Laurie's room. After another 30 minutes, Celia reappeared, hugging Laurie, who somewhat shyly slumped back. Frank dropped to his knees and hugged his daughter as she walked over to him. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I should have talked to you about this a long time ago. I just didn't think about it." "It's all right, Daddy," the girl spoke. "I just didn't realize what was going on and I got scared." Celia explained it all to me. "Now I know what to do." As she spoke, she took Celia's hand, and Frank realized that his daughter had made a new friend. He stood up and turned to Celia. "Thank you very much. It's good you were here. I must have panicked for a moment." He looked at his daughter. "I'm afraid I'm not very good with girls." Celia smiled, but no sooner had she spoken than Bobby popped up from around the corner. "Just because my stupid little sister has first period, does that mean we won't have dinner tonight?" "I'm starving." "Bobby!" Laurie shrieked, but Frank grabbed her before she could pounce on her older brother. "Bobby, if you talk to your sister like that again, I guarantee you'll go to bed hungry," warned Frank to his son. But before his threat sounded too ominous, he continued. "Now go wash your hands and set the table." Then he turned to Celia again. "The least we can do is offer you a meal for all you've done. It's not exactly fine dining, but there is something to eat." The young woman was clearly embarrassed. "Thank you, but I can't interfere." Her protests were cut short, however, when Laurie tugged on her arm. "Please, Celia, stay and eat with us." Looking at her new friend, Celia smiled and said, "Okay, Laurie, just for you." Looking at Frank, she smiled again. "Thank you. I would love to have dinner with your family." The four of them sat down at the table, and Celia was the subject of many questions from the two children about her experiences in law enforcement. Frank ate and listened, both amused by his children's curiosity and delighted at how easily Celia handled their questions. He suddenly realized that for the first time in a while, the two of them seemed to be coming out of a sorrowful shell. When dessert was finished, Frank sent Bobby and Laurie off to do chores and then offered Celia a cup of coffee. As they sat at the table, Frank had a chance to ask his questions. You seem to be comfortable with Bobby and Lori. Do you work with young people often? She smiled. I actually come from a big family, 2 brothers and 3 sisters. I was the oldest, so I guess I was a second mom to the others. She paused to take a sip of coffee, then continued. That's why I knew what to do with Lori this afternoon. I walked each of my sisters through the trauma of puberty. She looked at Frank and smiled again. For that matter, my dad was as helpless as you are today. Frank grinned mischievously. Well, all I can say is that I'm glad you ended up here. Even when I finally realized what was going on, I still wouldn't have known how to calm Lori down so quickly. She smiled in gratitude, but then her expression became more serious. How are they coping with the loss of their mother? She asked. Frank sighed. I guess that's about as well as could be expected. Lori was very clingy. I think she's sorely lacking in female influence. As for Bobby, it's hard to say. He's gotten moody and a little withdrawn, but I don't know if that's a result of Mary's death or just the fact that he's a teenager now. Celia looked at him sympathetically. From what I've seen, I think you're doing a great job with them. It's just going to take time, both for them and for you. With those words, she stood up and said, I really enjoyed the meal, Frank, but I've been intruding on your family for too long. I have to go now, but if you don't mind, I'd like to say goodbye to Lori and Bobby. When Frank nodded, she walked out into the hallway, and Frank heard her say goodbye to Bobby. She then spent a few minutes in Lori's room, and when she returned, Lori was walking with her arm around Celia's waist. She really has a new friend, Frank thought in surprise. A few days later, a package arrived in the mail for Lori. When his excited daughter opened the package, she found a pink stuffed elephant along with a note from Celia. Frank was delighted by this concern, but was puzzled by the choice. Lori's too old for stuffed animals, he thought, but was surprised to see the toy take a prominent place on Lori's bed. I guess she still has a little girl in her, he admitted. The next day, he called Celia's office to thank her. I never would have thought of it, he admitted, but somehow it was just what was needed for Lori. Celia was pleased that her daughter was pleased with her gift and made Frank promise to keep in touch and let her know how Lori and Bobby were doing. A few weeks later, Frank was paying his bills when Bobby's teacher called him one morning. I'd like to meet with you to talk about your son, the teacher told Frank. He's having discipline problems at school. Frank agreed to meet with her the next day, but decided not to say anything to Bobby that night. He wanted to wait until he knew what was going on before confronting his son. The meeting was scheduled for the next day after school while the children were in physical education. Mrs. Soldana, the home grade teacher, told the concerned father that Bobby's behavior in class had gotten worse over the past few months. At first, I didn't want to say anything because I know he's been through a lot, the teacher explained, but it seems to be getting worse. He's getting more and more distracted, not doing his homework, and the other teachers tell me that he's not paying attention in their classes. So far, he's always studied well, but this semester his grades will drop a lot if he doesn't do anything to change the situation. Frank was concerned. Do you think, Mrs. Soldana, how much does being a teenager have to do with it? No doubt it is a difficult age for children, especially boys, she told him, but we are used to it. I think his mother's death is affecting him more than he could tell you. Perhaps you should see a psychologist. Frank thanked the woman and returned to the car to anxiously wait for the kids to finish their gym class. He was upset to hear about Bobby's problems and was determined to have a long talk with the boy. When Frank brought Bobby and Lori home, he sent Lori to her room to start her homework and then led Bobby into the master bedroom. The boy's face darkened. He realized he was in trouble. Frank recounted his visit to Bobby's home teacher and gave some examples she had given him. What's going on, Bobby? Why are you acting like this? Demanded Frank. Just so, the boy replied sullenly. Come on, you're smarter than that, his father waved him off. Don't you care about your grades? Not really, Bobby muttered. Frank was annoyed by his son's unresponsiveness and in anger tried to shame him into responding. What would your mother think if she found out you blew it? Who cares? Shouted Bobby angrily back. She was such a slut. In shock and anger, Frank grabbed his son and yelled at him, Don't you ever talk about your mother like that! How can you say that? frightened by his father's fury and the pain of his tight grip, the boy whispered, "I saw her. I saw her doing it with that man." As soon as the words were off his lips, he collapsed on the bed and began to sob. In amazement, Frank sat down on the bed next to his son, put his arms around him, and cradled him as if he were a small child. "It's all right," he repeated, trying to soothe the boy's obvious distress. When Bobby's crying subsided, Frank lifted his son's head. "It's all right, Bobby. I'm not mad at you. Just tell me what you saw." His son looked at him with tears in his eyes. "It was last fall. You let me ride my bike to school one day, but I forgot my math homework, so I sneaked home at lunchtime and took it. While I was looking for it in my room, I heard my mom come in. I didn't want her to catch me, so I hid. That's when I heard a man's voice." "What man?" asked Frank a little too quickly. "I don't know," Bobby said. "Some guy. I've never seen him before." "It's okay," Frank reassured him. "Just tell me what happened next." "They came in here and then it got quiet and I thought I could sneak out. But then I heard my mom make a funny sound and I got scared and I looked into the room and they were lying on the bed." The words came out of his mouth faster and faster, like he was desperate to spit them out, and when he was done, he burst into tears again. "Why did she do that, Daddy? How could Mom act like such a slut?" Listening to his son's story, Frank felt himself going numb. But he didn't have time to deal with his own emotions. His son needed him. "I understand, Bobby. It's okay. I'm sorry you had to see that, but I'm glad you told me." He gently took his son by the shoulders and turned him around to face him. "Sometimes people we love make mistakes or do something we don't like. It doesn't mean we don't love them anymore, just that we don't like what they did. I don't know why your mother did what she did, son, but I know she loved you and Lori very much. I want you to remember only good things about her." He hugged his son and continued to talk to him for a while longer. When he felt the boy had calmed down enough, he gently asked him to get started on his homework, and Frank went to the kitchen to make dinner. Before Bobby left, Frank asked him not to say anything to Lori. The boy promised, and Frank was sure he would keep the disturbing news from his sister. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but as soon as the children went to bed, Frank began to vent his emotions. His first reaction was to deny what Bobby had told him. His son must have been mistaken or misinterpreted what he had seen. But he couldn't stick to that logic for long. His son was too upset about what had happened. After this confession, Frank's thoughts turned bitter. How could Mary have betrayed him? He thought they had a solid marriage. How could she have been having fun with someone on the side? And anyway, who was that man and how long had the affair lasted? It's hard to lose your wife in a plane crash, he thought in despair. It's even worse to find out you lost her long before that. Sleep didn't come that night, and the next day Frank was in a black mood. It was Tuesday, the day he usually went to the gym, and after the kids had gone to school, he decided to continue his exercise routine. For a while, the exercise helped distract him, but when he sat down on the treadmill, his thoughts returned to his wife's infidelity. How could Mary do that, and in our own bed? He asked. Somehow the location made the betrayal all the more horrible. And how could she have known I wouldn't be home? But the answer came immediately. It must have been one of those days when I went to the gym. I'm such a habitual person that she was sure the house would be empty. But the answer to that question immediately spawned others. If she planned her little meeting to fit my schedule, it's not like it happened suddenly. How often did she meet with him? She couldn't have met him every week. Her travel schedule could have gotten in the way. Each question seemed to beget another, and each one only added to his misery. He tried his best to act normal around Bobby and Lori, but over the next few days he continued to suffer. He decided to go to the pharmacy to buy antacids. He'd never had stomach problems before. His misery was compounded by the fact that he had no one to talk to about his discovery. He certainly didn't want to tell his parents or Meredith. He knew the news would be devastating to them. Likewise, he didn't want to talk to his friends, risking becoming the subject of neighborhood gossip. And, he thought, I certainly don't want to risk any of my classmates teasing Bobby or Lori. He felt trapped. He was working at his desk one evening when he noticed Celia Murray's business card. She told me to call her if I had any more information, he remembered. But in truth, he was desperately looking for any excuse to share his news with someone and get another point of view. He called the cell phone number she'd written on the card, and when he introduced himself, Celia seemed pleased to hear from him. But her tone changed to concerned when he said he needed to talk to her. "Are Lori and Bobby all right?" she asked anxiously. "They do, but I don't," he replied. "Would you mind having lunch with me tomorrow?" "It's not something I want to discuss over the phone." She quickly agreed and suggested a place near the GBI office where she worked. "It's a quiet place we can talk," she assured him. As he hung up the phone, Frank felt a little relieved at the prospect of talking. Celia was waiting in the restaurant when Frank appeared in the doorway. She smiled in greeting, but the smile quickly disappeared when she saw the distressed expression on his face. After they sat down at the table and ordered, she couldn't take it anymore. "For heaven's sake, Frank, what's wrong?" "You asked me to let you know if I had any more information about my wife," he said. "I don't know if it has anything to do with your investigation, but I just found out that Meredith has been cheating on me." As he said this, he was ashamed as tears flooded his eyes and streamed down his cheeks. Celia reached across the table and grabbed his hands. "Oh, Frank, this is terrible." "Tell me what happened." The whole story of the meeting with Bobby's teacher, the confrontation with his son, and Bobby's painful revelation poured out, interrupted only by the appearance of food. Celia listened in silence, letting him narrate at his own pace. Only when he reached the end did she speak. "Poor Bobby," she said. "No wonder he behaves like that at school. It must have been festering him ever since it all happened. And then her death. No wonder he's so worried." She had let go of Frank's hands when the waitress brought their order, but now leaned across the table to reach for him again. "It's hard for me to imagine what this has done to you, Frank," she said quietly, and Frank saw the sympathy in her eyes. "Were there any signs that something was wrong, Frank?" "Now that you look back, did you notice any clues?" she asked. "No," he replied. "I can't say I saw anything." "You know what they say. The husband is always the last to know." He lowered his gaze to his untouched plate for a moment, then looked up at the woman again. "Ever since she got her big promotion, our sex life has gone downhill dramatically. But because of the pressures of her new role and travel schedule, I figured it was understandable. I didn't like it, but I felt I had to put up with it for the sake of our family. She kept telling me that things would get better when she moved to the national level, but," he paused, "that didn't seem destined to happen." Then he frowned. "It's killing me that I don't have any answers. I don't know what kind of bastard she was sleeping with. I don't know when their affair started or how long it lasted. I don't know if she was in love with this guy or if she was planning on leaving me. Worst of all, I don't know why she did this to me and the kids." Celia squeezed his hands. "Frank, please listen to me. The truth is, it's unlikely you'll ever get answers to your questions. You're going to have to forget about all of this. With her dead, none of it matters anymore. All you can do is focus on taking care of your family and yourself." "I know you're right," he said, "but it hurts so much to be betrayed like that. I think when she stopped loving me—" "No," said Celia fiercely, "you are wrong. No matter what happened, it's obvious that Meredith still cared deeply about you and the kids. Look what you learned at IMC. She bought maximum life insurance to make sure you were all protected. She maxed out her contributions to the 401k plan to put money aside for your future. I don't know what else has happened in her life, but it all looks like care to me." "Thank you, Celia. I'll try to remember that." When they got up to leave, he looked at the table. None of them had touched their food. "I guess I'm not a good choice for lunch," he remarked wryly. "Don't worry about it," she replied lightly. "Skipping a meal or two is probably good for me." Frank looked over her slender figure. "She looks pretty good to me," he thought. "It's been a long time," he said to himself regretfully. As they were walking out the door, she took his hand. "Please stay in touch, Frank, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help." "I'd really like to help." Then she reached up and kissed his cheek. As she turned away, Frank thought a blush appeared on her cheeks. Back at home, Frank was surprised to find his mood lightened. "I guess I really needed to talk it out," he said to himself. The following Saturday, Frank was in the yard picking up limbs that had fallen during a thunderstorm. When he entered the house, he saw Lori talking on the phone. He turned to Bobby, who was standing nearby. "Did someone call?" asked Frank. "No," Bobby replied dismissively. She's just talking to her new best friend Celia. Frank was surprised. Does she call Celia a lot? And what's a BFF? Oh, Dad, Bobby replied in despair. You're totally off the mark. BFF is best friend forever. At that moment, Lori looked up and saw her father. Daddy, can we take Celia to dinner? Let me talk to her, he said, holding out his hand to his daughter. When she handed him the phone, he said, Hi, Celia, I think you heard that. Would you like to have dinner with Lori tonight? Bobby and I will be here too. He heard her melodious laugh, followed by a quick agreement. Very well, he said. Why don't you come here about 6 o'clock? After they agreed, Frank hung up the phone and turned to his daughter. Well, here she comes, he said. I hope you'll be happy. Oh, yes, Daddy, she squeaked. Well, in that case, you and Bobby need to clean up the place so she doesn't think we're living like pigs. Oh, Daddy, do I have to? Complained Bobby. But before Frank could answer, the boy turned and began to gather up the clothes he had left in the room. He's still a teenager, Frank thought, but he seems to be getting better. Turning to head for the kitchen, Frank began to ponder what dish he should make. Definitely something better than spaghetti and meatballs, he thought, remembering the first time Celia had dined with them. He finally settled on the fish dish, which he considered one of his specialties. He was sure he could make it, and the kids liked it, which was always a plus. For that, he knew he would have to make a trip to the grocery store. After explaining his errand to Bobby and Lori, he told them to stay in the house until he returned. He found a nice piece of salmon in the seafood department, and then decided to pick up some dessert at the bakery. I should grab a nice bottle of wine, he thought, and directed his cart to the appropriate aisle. Once he found what he wanted, he looked in the floral section of the store and bought a bouquet for the table. On the way home, he thought about what he was doing. I'm really gorging myself on this food, he realized with surprise. Eventually, he decided it was because he owed Celia a good lunch. After all, I've ruined her lunch, he said to himself. Celia rang the doorbell at 6 o'clock, and before Frank could get to the door, Lori was already ushering her in. To Frank's amazement, even Bobby deigned to show up, and the teenager made polite conversation. Frank, for his part, felt a little awkward and inarticulate, but if Celia noticed it, she didn't show it in any way. Instead, she chatted cheerfully with Lori and willingly went with her to see what the girl wanted to show Celia in her room. By the time they reappeared, dinner was almost ready. The dinner was a great success. Celia was duly impressed by his culinary abilities. Oh, a man who can cook. Mother warned me about the likes of you, she teased, and the fact that he was clearly at ease with the children, both of whom chattered away in response to her questions. When dessert was finished, she insisted on joining in the cleanup, and with her help, the dishes were soon put away, rinsed, and put in the dishwasher to run later. At this point, Bobby excused himself to continue a video game he had paused, and Lori wanted to watch a favorite program she had videotaped, so the two adults filled their glasses with wine and went out into the living room. Frank, it was wonderful, Celia complimented him. I don't know when I've had such a good time. Thank you so much for inviting me. I don't think Lori would ever talk to me again if I didn't, Frank laughed, and Celia joined him. She's a wonderful girl and you're lucky to have her, she replied. And her father's doing a pretty good job, too. Frank felt his face redden. But then Celia's face took on a more serious expression. Frank, besides having a great time with you, I'm glad you invited me because I have some information I want to share with you. Frank caught the new intonation in her voice and looked at her curiously. This is very confidential, Frank, but I think I know you well enough to trust you. And it concerns you, at least indirectly. Now she had definitely gotten his attention. As you know, Celia began, the GBI was supposed to conduct a routine investigation before issuing your wife's death certificate. And as you also know, we found nothing that would give us a reason to refuse to issue a certificate that was properly issued. She took a deep breath and continued. Naturally, we did the same thing with John Collier, but we discovered a few oddities. First, it turned out that he was in financial trouble after a series of bad investment decisions. Frank nodded. What Celia had said matched what Amanda Collier had told him. Furthermore, over the past few weeks, Celia continued, IMC Security has informed us that they have discovered what appears to be significant irregularities in the Southeastern Accounting Department headed by John Collier. Even more disturbing, they believe they have uncovered a fraudulent billing scheme that may have resulted in the embezzlement of millions of dollars from IMC, and John Collier appears to have authorized it. Poor Amanda, Frank commented. She didn't deserve that. But then he began to consider what Celia had told him, and new possibilities opened before him. Could John Collier have had a hand in the disaster? He asked. Could it have been a way of covering his tracks? When Celia said nothing, Frank's imagination kicked into overdrive. What if Meredith found out about Collier's scheme? What if he killed her to silence her and used the plane crash to hide the evidence? Maybe he's still alive? Maybe he's hiding out in some villa by the sea and laughing at all of us? Take your time, Frank, Celia urged. You're getting carried away. The most likely scenario remains that the plane went down unexpectedly, as we've assumed all along. If Collier was really involved in the embezzlement scheme, the crash interrupted his plans. We'll explore all the possibilities, but we can't jump to conclusions, and neither should you. But Frank had a hard time shutting off his imagination. You don't think Meredith could have been involved, do you? He asked sharply. Celia sighed. It's not out of the question, she agreed, but we don't think it's likely. For one thing, if she was involved, it would mean she planned ahead of time to abandon her family. It's unusual for a mother to abandon her children, especially children their age, she said, gesturing to the children's rooms. Collier, on the other hand, had no children, and his wife reported that their marriage was on the verge of falling apart at the time of his disappearance. Moreover, unlike Collier, Meredith's finances were in perfect order, and prior to her disappearance, she had done nothing to suggest that she was involved in any plan, if indeed there was one. In fact, her actions were exactly the opposite of those of a person planning to disappear. But it's all just speculation. The only fact we have, Celia continued, is that Meredith's plane did indeed crash into the sea. She had hoped to reassure Frank, but when she looked at the man, she realized he was still upset by her revelations. Frank, you have to promise me that you won't say anything about any of this. It's very confidential, and if it gets out, it could jeopardize our investigation. It could also lead to my dismissal. This made Frank tense. He realized that Celia had taken a risk in confiding in him, and he was obliged to remain silent. I understand, Celia, and I promise I won't compromise your investigation. But I have to ask, why did you tell me all this? She looked at him seriously. It's unlikely, Frank, but there's always the possibility that you'll hear something or learn something that will help us shed some light on all this. If you do, Frank, promise me you'll get back to me right away. No Lone Rangers, please. He returned her gaze. I promise, Celia. Then he smiled. Besides, if I have to mess with you again, it won't be such a drag. The smile she gave him seemed to light up the entire room. Shortly afterwards, Celia had to leave. Before doing so, she said goodbye to Bobby and Lori. Frank noted that Bobby had interrupted his game to say goodnight to her, which was a real compliment from him. Lori walked her friend to the door again, snatching Celia's promise to call her. But this time, after Lori hugged her, Celia didn't fail to lean against the door and kiss Frank on the cheek. As she walked to her car, Lori looked at her dad and said, She likes you, Dad. Frank smiled at his daughter and pulled her close to him. Well, I like her too. When everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Frank lay in his bed, thinking over what Celia had told him and all the different scenarios he had imagined. Oh, Mary, he thought, what have you gotten yourself into? Finally, he fell into a restless sleep. A week later, Frank was sitting at his computer and noticed something unusual. He was reading about some of his favorite sports teams, and as he was about to click on the Falcons tab, he noticed a Facebook icon right above it. On a whim, he clicked on it. Frank wasn't a Facebook follower. In fact, he rarely logged onto the site at all. The only reason he had an account was so he could keep track of his children. Bobby and Lori loved the social networking site and used it as another way to stay in touch with their friends. Frank didn't mind at first, but after reading a couple of scary articles about some of the pitfalls, he started his own account and insisted that Bobby and Lori add Bobby and Lori as friends. He also asked them to give him the passwords to their pages. That way, he reasoned, I'd be able to see all the messages and pictures they posted, as well as anything their friends sent them. More importantly, he thought, Bobby and Lori would know that he could spy on them, and that he hoped would encourage them to be discreet. When he logged onto his page, most of what he saw didn't interest him. But he did notice a friend request from someone he'd never heard of, Tom Thomason. The name seemed unfamiliar to him, and there was no photo, just a silhouette. When Frank clicked on the name, the stranger's page blandly informed him that personal information was only available to friends. "Hey, Bobby," he called out. "Do we know any Tom Thomason?" His son walked into the room and saw his father browsing Facebook. "Oh, that guy. Just ignore him, Dad. He's been talking me into adding him as a friend for weeks now. I just delete his requests." At that moment, Lori peeked into the room. "Yeah, he tried to get me to friend him too. He's just some creep on Facebook." It was enough to get Frank's attention. Some unknown person wanted to make contact not only with him, but also with his children. Frank knew that there were all kinds of scammers out there, as well as some much scarier predators. He was alarmed, but didn't want to scare the children, so he only said, "You two did exactly the right thing," he assured them. "Never respond online to anyone you don't know well." As he searched for a way to protect his family, an unexpected idea occurred to him. Maybe Celia can help us find out who this creep Thomason is. He called her home, and she must have seen his name in the caller ID, because she answered warmly, "Hi, Frank." "Hi, Celia, I'm glad I caught you. Is there any chance you could come over? Something strange has come up, and I'd like to find out with you if you're free." "It's nothing serious, is it? Bobby and Lori are fine, aren't they?" As he comforted her, Frank couldn't help but notice that she seemed as concerned about his children as he was himself. It gave him a warm feeling. She told him she was working in the yard, but would be able to drive up in 45 minutes. To Frank's surprise, almost exactly the minute her car pulled up to the curb. With Mary, he remembered, he was lucky if she was no more than an hour late, trying to make her image perfect. But Celia arrived right on time, clearly freshly washed, dressed in a casual but attractive outfit, with neatly styled hair and fresh makeup. It was obvious that she had made an effort, even in such a short time. "You look good, Celia." "You didn't need to dress up for us," he told her. She squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Frank. I wanted it so much." Once she was in the house, Frank called his children over. As they noisily entered the room, he asked them to tell Celia about their potential Facebook friend. Bobby, as the official expert in the family, took the opportunity to brag, quickly logging into each of the family's 3 Facebook accounts in turn and receiving friend requests from the mysterious Tom Thomason. Praising Bobby's skill, Celia sat down in front of the screen and called up all the unread and archived messages, but couldn't find any additional information. Finally, she looked up at Bobby and Lori. The most likely answer is some sort of marketing ploy. If you accepted the request, you'd probably get all sorts of ads for junk you don't need or offers to buy imaginary gold from Nigeria. There are bad people in the world, and you should never let strangers know about you. Okay? Both children nodded solemnly, and Frank thought to himself that the message he had heard from Celia had probably had a stronger effect on them than when he had delivered it. While they were working on the computer, it was getting dark outside, and Frank knew his kids would be hungry soon. "Celia, we'll probably go out to dinner soon. It won't be anything fancy, just a family restaurant, but we'd love for you to join us if you can." As Frank had anticipated, Lori and even Bobby immediately began demanding that she come with them. She laughingly surrendered to the inevitable. The 4 of them piled into Frank's sedan and drove to a casual spot near their home. As they drove, Celia began asking the children about what she'd seen on their Facebook pages, and soon Lori and Bobby were eagerly talking about their friends and activities. Listening to the conversation, Frank wondered, Celia probably already knows more about what's going on in Lori and Bobby's lives than Mary ever did. He remembered that on the rare occasions they had gone out together before her death, Meredith's conversations had mostly revolved around her work. He felt guilty for his infidelity, but knew it was true. The lively conversation continued during dinner and the drive home, and Frank was delighted when Celia entered the house with them. The children immediately sat down in front of the television and asked Celia to watch with them, but she waved them off. "I need to talk to your daddy for a while." She took his hand and led him into the living room. After they sat down, her face became serious and she said, "I didn't want to alarm Bobby and Lori, but I don't think those Facebook requests were a marketing ploy. The Bureau has received alerts about some identity theft scams, but they usually don't target children. To me, it looks like someone is purposely trying to get your family's information. The thought of his children being in danger sent a chill through Frank. Who could it be? What could they possibly want? I don't know, Frank, she replied. This is unlike any cyber fraud model I've seen before. What can we do? Close their Facebook accounts? Maybe keep them off the net altogether? She looked thoughtful. I don't think it's necessary, provided they're careful not to communicate with strangers. And if they get nonsense emails with embedded websites, warn them never to click on the links. She thought for a moment longer, then spoke. The problem with the internet is that it's so amorphous. You can't tell who you're dealing with or where they are. But it's not as opaque as a lot of people think. I have a friend in the federal government who might be able to help us. He probably won't be able to find out who Tom Thomason is, but he might be able to tell us where he lives. Let me call on Monday and let you know what I find out. With those words, she got up and went to her room to say goodnight to the two children. When she returned, Frank walked her to the door, but before she opened it, he hugged her. You've been like a guardian angel to us, he said sincerely. I don't know what we would have done without you. She looked into his eyes for a moment and then kissed him quickly on the lips. I don't know if I want to be an angel, she said with a wink. They don't have much fun. She then turned and walked quickly to her car, leaving Frank standing there bewildered. True to her word, Celia called Frank late Monday morning. Do you know anyone in Palm Beach, Florida? She asked. Not a soul, Frank replied. Whoever Tom Thomason is, he created his Facebook account with a zip code starting with 334, so he's somewhere in Palm Beach County, she said. I can't imagine why someone in Palm Beach would try to contact us, Frank said, but at least he's not around. That's reassuring. I agree, Celia said. Besides, we've been tracking a lot of scams in South Florida, so maybe this really is some new kind of internet scam. Just make sure Bobby and Lori have nothing to do with these friend requests. I will, Celia, and thank you. I feel so much better about the whole thing. I'm so glad I could help, Frank. In spite of what he had said to Celia, Frank was not in the least reassured. On the contrary, it seemed to him that he and his children were under continuous attack. First came the terrible news of Meredith's death. Then poor Bobby confessed that his wife had cheated on him. Then he got word that Mary might have been involved in some fraudulent business dealings before her death. And now some unknown person was trying to get information about his children. Frank felt like they were under siege, and he decided he would fight back. His first priority was to find the enemy in Palm Beach County and confront him. But how could he do that? A cursory internet search showed that the county had a population of 1.3 million. Looking for Tom Thomason would be like looking for a short stick in tall grass. Besides, Frank thought, it was just as likely that the name could be a fake. Frank's ordered mind continued to beat over the problem. Then an idea struck him. If I can't find Thomason, maybe I can get him to find me. A plan began to form in his mind. The chances are slim, he admitted, but it's all I've got. The first thing he needed to do was to get Bobby and Lori out of the way. It was almost time for summer vacation, and that gave Frank an idea. He dialed his in-laws' number. Dad, would you and Mom like Bobby and Lori to come visit us for a week? I'll need to go out of town during that time, so you'd be a big help. When the children's grandfather happily agreed and all the issues surrounding their stay were resolved, Frank hung up the phone and immediately called Delta. I'd like to book a flight to Palm Beach. His children welcomed the news of their upcoming visit to their grandparents, but their enthusiasm waned when they learned that their father would not be traveling with them. It would be the first time they would be separated since their mother's death, and the prospect brought back the fear of abandonment they had felt since then. Frank hated to cause the children any distress, but he felt that he must do what he intended, and he succeeded in persuading them. A week before their visit began, Frank began to be plagued by doubts. Am I doing the right thing? He asked himself. But despite the uncertainty, the thought of doing nothing was worse. His inner turmoil was briefly interrupted by a phone call from Celia, who called to inquire how he and his family were doing. After a few minutes of conversation, the tone of her voice changed slightly, and Frank thought she sounded almost shy. I was wondering if you wanted to get together next week. I haven't seen you and the kids in a while, and her voice trailed off uncertainly. I'd love to do that, Celia, but then I'm taking the kids to their grandparents. We'll be gone all week. Oh, she said, I understand. Maybe some other time. I'd like that very much, Celia, he said fervently. Frank felt bad about lying to Celia about his plans, but he told himself, at least it was partly true. Besides, he was sure he knew what she would say if he revealed his true plans. When Frank returned home and took the children to his relatives in the village, he immediately sat down at the family computer. One of the reasons he asked Meredith's family to take his children was that he knew they didn't have a computer. So he felt safe logging on to Lori's Facebook. Sure enough, a friendship request came in from Tom Thomason. Frank clicked on the accept option and quickly received confirmation that Lori was now friends with this stranger. If nothing comes of this, Frank thought, I'll just unsubscribe from him later. Next came the hardest part, pretending to be a 12-year-old girl. He studied his daughter's previous messages and decided that he could imitate her style quite well. I may not be able to fool her friends, he admitted to himself, but I hope I can fool Tom Thomason. He decided that his first communication should lay the foundation and wrote a short note of his visit to the country, Lori. Just a little news for her friends, thought Frank, nothing to arouse the suspicions of the lurkers. The next day he planned to set a trap. OMG, I'm going to Florida. My best friend Celia offered to take me with her and my dad agreed. Flying out tomorrow, can't wait. Frank decided to call Celia by her first name because it seemed to him that neither Lori's friends nor Tom Thomason knew her. He hoped Celia wouldn't mind. Now that the lure was in the water, Frank hoped he could jiggle it enough to get the fish's attention. I can't believe I'm in Palm Beach. That's to die for. In the evening, Frank posted the following piece. Spent the day at the beach. I'm going to be so tan. The next morning, Frank posted a note that he hoped would catch on. I'm going back to the beach tonight. Tomorrow, Celia's taking me shopping on Worth Avenue. We'll have lunch at Tabu's. Too coola. As soon as the entry appeared on Lori's page, Frank headed to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Soon, he was already settled in his seat for the 2-hour flight to Palm Beach. Looking out the window, he remembered that he had been to Palm Beach once before. In fact, he and Mary had driven through town on their way back from their honeymoon in Miami Beach. They'd driven over the Lake Worth Bridge and then traveled down Southern Ocean Boulevard, admiring the mansions overlooking the Atlantic. After landing, Frank rented a car and drove to the motel in West Palm Beach where he had booked a room. There was a fast food restaurant across the street, and he grabbed a sandwich and a Coke, which he ate in the room while studying a map of the city on his laptop. He hoped he was doing the right thing. After breakfast, he checked Lori's Facebook page, but found only a few envious replies from her classmates. He didn't expect Thomason to contact him, but he hoped his fishing expedition might find something. Around 10 a.m., he got in his car and drove east over the Royal Park Bridge, turned south, and then east again to Worth Avenue. He wanted to be there early, and he needed to park the car on the street so he could get there quickly if necessary. After driving around the block where the restaurant was several times, he was beginning to wonder if he had miscalculated. But suddenly a car pulled out in front of him, and he was able to pull into the parking space. Setting the meter down, he walked down the street in front of the restaurant. Noticing a bench in the shade, he gratefully took a seat on it. He grabbed his baseball cap and sunglasses and put them on, hoping to disguise himself. Then he pulled out a copy of the Palm Beach Post and pretended to read while looking around the street. As he sat there, the realization of how flimsy his plan was slowly began to set in. He had no idea if the mysterious Tom Thomason had seen the fake posts on Lori's Facebook page and would show up in response. Worse, Frank had no idea who he was looking for. Unless the mystery man turned out to be John Collier, which Frank thought was unlikely, how would he be able to recognize the threat? All he could hope for was to spot the suspicious man, whatever that meant, and come face to face with him. The street was crowded, and Frank kept trying to keep track of all the passers-by. The restaurant was starting to fill up, and his stomach rumbled as he watched the people coming in. He cursed himself for not thinking to bring a sandwich, but he didn't dare leave his post. Time stretched slowly as he sat there, and after a while he saw the crowd in the restaurant begin to thin. Glancing at his watch, he realized it was over an hour later. What an idiot, he thought. I wouldn't be any worse off if I stayed home, and at least I could see Celia again. While he was looking at the shoppers passing by, a woman strolling across the street caught his eye. Here I go again, Frank thought, seeing Mary in a crowd of strangers. In fact, he noted, the woman looked nothing like Meredith at all. Meredith had shoulder-length brunette hair, and this woman was a blonde with a short haircut. And her clothes were different from anything Frank had ever seen Meredith wear. But there was something eerily familiar about her, and as he continued to watch her, Frank realized that it was her gait that had triggered his reaction. He impulsively got up and followed her. Glancing down the street, he saw that the blonde had reached the corner and was trying to hail a cab. Risking his life, Frank ran across Worth Avenue and jumped into the car. Just as he pulled away from the curb, he saw the woman climb into the back seat of the cab and race down the avenue toward the Atlantic. Before reaching Southern Ocean Boulevard, the cab turned left onto County Road and headed north. Frank followed it for some distance. Finally, he saw that the cab turned left onto a suburban street and kept going until it got almost to Lake Worth. Frank stopped the car at the curb about a soccer field away and watched as the woman paid the driver and then entered an elegant house that faced the lake. Frank squinted his eyes, trying to get a good look at her. With her hair color and short cut, she looked nothing like Mary. But she was the same height and weight, and as she walked down the path toward the house, Frank was again amazed at her gait. Sitting in the car, Frank suddenly remembered a book he had read a long time ago. In the story, an actor needed a disguise. But instead of a false mustache or wig, he just put pebbles in his shoes. If someone sees me, the actor told his friend, they'll say, looks like that guy, but it's not him, because I'll walk differently. It works the other way too, thought Frank. As he recalled the book, the certainty grew in him that he had just seen his deceased wife. Trying to hold back his growing anger, he ran down the street and walked to the door. He rang the doorbell and crossed his arms and waited. Opening the door, the woman looked at him with a perplexed look. Then she did a double take and shrieked, "Frank, what are you doing here?" "Hello, Mary. Funny to meet you here," he said sarcastically. After a moment's hesitation, she spread her arms to hug him, but he quickly raised his hands to stop her. "Don't touch me," he growled. Then, unable to contain his anger any longer, he shouted, "How could you do this to me? How could you leave Bobby and Lori?" Throwing an anxious glance outside, Meredith grabbed his arm and dragged him into the house, slamming the door behind her. "I did it all for you, baby, for you and the kids," she urged. "You have to believe me. It was the only way out." As she spoke, every now and then she looked around nervously. "What the hell are you talking about?" demanded Frank hotly. "You're missing the point. None of this makes any sense." "Sit down, little one," she coaxed him. "You have to let me explain everything." She was still speaking loudly and rubbed her hands together nervously, sitting down and urging him on. When Frank sat down, an icy calm descended upon him. "Okay, Mary, I'm listening." "I was so close to it, baby. I had a coveted big job in my pocket, but then the damn economy went down. I knew if I could get a little more bang for the buck in the region, the economy would recover and the promotion would be secured." She smiled pleadingly and held out her palms to her husband. "And Frank, once I got this job, we'd be on Easy Street. No worries about paying for college for the kids, no worries about retirement, no worries ever again." Frank could barely contain himself. Was it all about money and Mary's position in the company? Meredith's hands rested on her lap again. "So John and I?" "John Collier," said Frank grimly. "Yes," she continued, not catching his mood. "You've met him. Anyway, he and I figured out a way to move a few sales from our biggest accounts. We knew they'd show up eventually. We just booked them earlier, in the current quarter. Every other region was reporting a significant decrease in sales, and we had a significant increase. The corporation was just thrilled. We earned the biggest bonuses the company has ever paid," she says proudly. Then the smile slid off her face like a cloth falling to the floor. But the economy was getting worse, not better. And when John told me it would all come out eventually, I knew we had to do something about it. We knew we'd need a lot of money to pull this thing off, so John created a dummy vendor account and started sending fake invoices to IMC. They're so sloppy and wasteful over there, they didn't even notice. "So you were planning to fake your death in a plane crash to cover your tracks?" asked Frank. That's right, kid, she said, as if Frank was her star pupil. With enough money, it's not hard to get someone to leave a Zodiac motorboat with a GPS signal in the Caribbean. We just homed in on the signal and landed right next to it. So this whole thing was just a way to steal a lot of money and abandon the family? Asked John bitterly. No, baby, she protested. That's not it at all. I knew I'd have to get out of sight for a while, but I made sure you and the kids were okay. I took out life insurance and put everything I could into my 401k so you guys would have plenty of money, she said proudly. And you thought having enough money would make up for the loss of my wife and the mother of our children? This time she heard his bitterness. No, baby, no. You don't understand. I was going to come back for you. As soon as things settled down, I was going to contact you. We could go somewhere safe, baby. We could be together. As she spoke, her eyes continued to dart around the room. Frank looked at her with a stony stare. You're only missing one thing, he said in an even voice. What is it, baby? She asked. You forgot about having fun with John Collier, he said. She was scared at first, but then she stood up and held out her arms to him. No, baby, it wasn't like that. John and I just worked together. We were never more than co-workers. Don't lie to me, Meredith, Frank snapped back. Bobby saw you two together in our bedroom. She sighed. God, did Bobby see us? Oh, that's awful. A sob caught in her throat, but then she came to her senses and straightened up again. It was just one time, baby. He said he wouldn't help me unless I gave myself to him. But it was just one time, I swear. Frank stood up. Ignoring her, he looked around. Come out, John, he said loudly. I know you're out here somewhere. Meredith continued to wail. No, baby, it's just me. It was just one time. But no sooner had she continued than John Collier appeared from the bedroom. He was wearing a robe and had his hands in his pockets. Lay off, Mary, he knows, Collier muttered. Though he guessed they lived together, hearing Collier use his wife's favorite name made Frank wince. Meredith began to cry. He must have found us through Facebook, Collier grumbled. I warned you, but you just had to check your two offspring. Then his tone changed to cold and hard. But that doesn't matter now. We need to get out of here. He turned to Frank and pulled an automatic rifle from his robe pocket, which he pointed in Frank's direction. As for you, bright boy, you're the only one who knows we're still alive. No, John, no, screamed Meredith, but Collier ignored her. Looks like your kids are going to lose not only their daddy, but their mommy too, he said with a chuckle, raising his gun at Frank. I wouldn't do that if I were you, came a voice from the hallway. All three turned around in amazement and saw the figure of Celia Murray appear in front of them, holding a Smith & Wesson automatic at Collier's throat. Before Collier could react, a second voice came from behind him. Drop the gun, Collier! It's over! Special Agent Harold Barnes emerged from the kitchen, his gun also pointed at Collier. The former head of the accounting department looked at the two agents hostilely, but then his shoulders slumped. He dropped the gun to the carpet and slowly raised his hands. While Barnes held the gun at gunpoint, Celia quickly went behind the sullen man and twisted one of his arms behind his back, snapping handcuffs around his wrist. She then slid the other arm down and snapped the second handcuff. After securing Collier, she repeated the procedure with Meredith. As the two lay on the floor, Barnes made a cell phone call to the Palm Beach Police Department. A second call went to the local FBI office. A short time later, the house was crowded with uniformed and plainclothes police officers. Frank just stood back, looking dumbfounded at what was happening. As the fugitives were led away, Frank scrutinized them both. Collier was muttering to himself. Meredith was crying. Neither looked in Frank's direction. When they left, Celia walked over to Barnes, hugged him, and kissed him on the cheek. Thank you for coming with me, partner. I owe you a great debt of gratitude. The senior agent smiled. No, you don't owe me anything. Solving this case will reflect very well in our personal affairs. When Barnes left, Celia finally looked at Frank. To his amazement, she walked over to him, put her arms around his neck, and sobbed. You big idiot, don't you ever do that to me again. You could have killed yourself. He held her tightly until her crying subsided. Then he pulled her away from him enough that he could look into her face. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "How did you know where to find me?" She smiled through her tears. "Lori called me to chat. When she told me you weren't with them at their grandparents' house, I suspected you were going to do something stupid and started making inquiries. When I saw her Facebook posts, I called the airline and found out that you had booked a flight to Palm Beach. I talked Harold into coming with me, and we've been following you since first thing in the morning." She shook her head. "We almost lost you when you took off after that cab, but Harold guessed which way you turned and was right." Frank pulled her even tighter against him. "I guess you really are my guardian angel," he said and kissed her. 2 years later, Frank pulled the collar of his coat tighter around his neck. The humidity was high as always, and the wind off Puget Sound was cold and damp. Still, Frank thought, it feels good to be here. The last 2 years had been difficult in many ways. If it was a terrible shock for Frank to discover that his wife was alive, the consequences were even worse for Bobby and Lori. The fact that she went to trial and was convicted of numerous criminal charges only added to the family's pain. During the inevitable media hype surrounding the arrest and trial, Frank feared his children would not make it through. The divorce was a mere formality. Legally, Meredith could no longer be dead, but she would spend the next 12 years of her life in Arendelle State Prison. The International Marketing Corporation, of course, demanded that Frank return not only Meredith's life insurance policy, but also most of her 401k, since it was funded by bonuses she hadn't earned. As the innocent party, Frank may have had reason to keep some of the funds, but he wanted nothing to do with any part of his ex-wife's money. Instead, he began urgently looking for work, as his family's savings were nearly depleted. The offer he received from a large aerospace company was coveted not only because it would provide for his family, but also because it meant moving across the country. There were too many reminders of Meredith in Atlanta, and too many questions from friends and others that he and his children couldn't answer. Finding a new place to live and work seemed like the best solution for all of them. Frank didn't want to leave the state where he and his children were born, but he was ready to embrace the Pacific Northwest and start a new life. They were lucky enough to sell the house in Atlanta and were able to buy a nice, albeit slightly smaller house in Seattle. Meredith had always wanted to live in a luxurious house, and Frank was happy with something more cozy. The kids seemed to like it too, and they were already making friends at the new school. He walked in from the deck and looked around for his car keys. Finding them, he poked his head into the kitchen to look for his wife. "Come on, Angel, let's go get our kids." Celia smiled happily at him. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.